to this webinar, which is following the West and South Asian regional round of the John Jackson Book competition. This webinar is the fourth of a series of webinars on the topic Revitalising the WTO Rules-Based System, so it can address global challenges. And during the 2 hours of today, we will focus on the Asian perspective. Each of the previous webinars focused on different perspectives, and this one will be on the Asian region. This webinar is taking place in the context of the John Jackson Book competition, following a brain idea of Professor Ramirez-Robles that will be today with us, and the goal is to let's say create a bridge between youth and experts for youth people, participants of the competition, but also students interested in this field of law to be able to hear distinguished experts from this field. And because of that, I would like to say one word to thank you, the speakers and reporter, to be with us today. So, like, warm thanks from my end and on the behalf of the organizing committee of the John Jackson. And on this note, I would like also to congratulate the participants that took part in the competition in the regional rounds, since yesterday was the closing of the last of the 6 regional rounds of the competition. This being said, I will also like to thank the Universidad de Guadalajara and Campus Costa, with who we are co-organizing this series of webinars, and especially the representative, Dr. Edna Ramirez-Robles, that will be with us today. She's a professor of international economic law and president of Public Law Academy at Universidad de Guadalajara and Campus Costa, and she's also senior consultant on international trade and investment issues. In 2021, she is consulting with the WTO and for the World Bank, and she's a formal legal trade officer at the WTO in the Legal Affairs Division, IDB and UNCTAD. She's also a formal editorial assistant of the Professor John Jackson, after who we named the competition, at the Georgetown Law Center, and also worked at the Graduate Institute for Development Studies in Geneva, also technical supporter of the competition. She has consulted in more than 53 jurisdictions worldwide. And it's my great pleasure. I think I will leave her the floor, and I will wish you a wonderful and pleasant webinar. I'm certain that you will all learn and have a chance to hear wonderful points and let's say food for thoughts, as Edna is saying.
Thank you very much, Louis. I would like to first thank ELSA International, specifically to Louis Fremont and his team for your commitment in assisting with the different tasks involved of this academic event. My gratitude also goes to the authorities of the Universidad de Guadalajara, the General Rector, Dr. Ricardo Villanueva Lomelí, Carlos Iván Moreno Arellano, Dr. Jorge Tellez Lopez, Dr. Marco González Mora, for being so supportive with the internationalization of our university, Campus Costa in Puerto Vallarta. Thank you very much to all the technical team of the Universidad de Guadalajara, who has made possible the throughout 4 continents and 6 different time zones from Mexico, Geneva, China, Singapore, India, and New Zealand, where now is 12 a.m., made possible this connection and this event. Thank you very much. Last but not least, my deepest appreciation goes to our speakers and rapporteur. This webinar, which is titled Revitalizing the World Trade Organization Rules-Based System so it can address global challenges, an Asian perspective. Today, we have an exceptional group of experts that have dealt directly with international trade issues for their entire careers. It is my sincere honor to introduce to our speakers and rapporteur, Professor Dr. Zhao received her degree of bachelor's, master's, and PhD in law from the Law Schools School of Peking University in China. She currently serves as research fellow at the Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation, CAITEC, and she's also a guest professor at Peking University, Fudan University, and several other universities in China. Previously, she served as Minister Consular in charge of legal affairs at China mission to the WTO. During the time, she served as chair to the WTO's Committee on Trade-Related Investment Measure, TRIMS. Ms. Zhao then served as Commissioner for Trade Negotiations at Chinese Ministry of Commerce Department for WTO affairs, where she participated in a number of important negotiations on international trade, including the Trade Facilitation Agreement negotiations and negotiations on expansion for the Information Technology Agreement. She's a former WTO appellate body member. Dr. Penelope Ridings is an international lawyer and arbitrator practicing in the field of public international law, including international trade and investment, law of the sea, and environment. She's a member of the pool of arbitration under the Multi-Party Interim Appeal Arrangement, the MPIA, and has been a panelist arbitrating WTO disputes. She was formerly New Zealand's chief international legal advisor, trade negotiator, and she's a candidate for the International Law Commission for the election of 2021. Professor Michael Ewing Cho is a WTO chair at the Faculty Law of the National University of Singapore and US. Michael worked in Allen Glenhill before joining NUS, where he started the first WTO World Trade Law course in Singapore and was involved in the negotiations for some Singapore's early FTAs. He has been a consultant to the Singapore government, the ADB, ASEAN, UNCTAD, the World Bank, and the WTO. Michael has advised government officials all over the world on trade investment law, trade and investment law, as well as governance. He has taught in a number of universities worldwide, including the Universidad de Guadalajara. He has published extensively and sits on the editorial board of the Journal of International Economic Law, the JIL, that was founded by Professor John Jackson. His latest book is International Trade and Food Security, Exploring Collective Food Security in Asia. He has received several teaching excellence awards and was awarded as a social entrepreneur in 2007 and Inspiring Mentor Award in 2009. Dr. Mohamed Said, he is a senior trade and development professional, and he's advisor on trade facilitation and policy for business at the International Trade Center, the ITC, in Geneva, where he leads the trade facilitation team. His work focuses on assisting beneficiary countries to promote trade through improving the competitiveness of the private business. He has provided advisory services to more than 50 developing countries. If we talk about jurisdictions, this number will triple. So for their trade policy reforms. Before joining this assignment, he served as senior technical advisor on trade and transfer facilitation with UNCTAD, that is where we work together. And then Dr. Said has extensive experience in handling the complex issues of international trade law. He's privileged to serve on 6 dispute panels of the WTO, including 4 as chairman. Professor Dr. James Nadu Parak is professor and head of the Center for Trade and Investment, established by the Ministry of Commerce and Industry at the Indian Institute of Foreign Trade. He's currently on leave from the Jindal Global Law School, where he joined as a founding faculty. Our rapporteur, Pallavi Bajaj. Pallavi is an international trade policy advisor with over a decade working with international organizations and chambers of commerce on policy issues at the intersection of trade and technology. She is partner at TQ Consulting and as a digital services entrepreneur, as director at Ballistic Learning, director at Risk Advisory and APNA Dr. Telemedicine, and managing director at Little Yellow Beetle Digital Branding. Thank you very much to our speakers for joining us today. Without further preamble, I will proceed to set the scene. The WTO faces significant challenges that have deeply affected its ability to carry out its core functions. Its negotiation function, where only the Trade Facilitation Agreement has entered into force in 2017. It's true that negotiations on e-commerce, expanded services coverage, investment facilitation, and fisheries subsidies are ongoing, but have yet to produce results. In its quasi-judicial function, members have complained about aspects of the dispute settlement system, including judicial activism since the earliest days. The US refusal to appoint new members to the appellate body as their terms expired resulted in rendering it ineligible by the end of 2019. Furthermore, we can't ignore the lack of compliance of WTO members. Lack of compliance with WTO obligations, including the trade war between the US and China. In addition to the existing challenges at the WTO itself, there are global challenges that need the organization to play a role in addressing. These go from pandemics, starting with the COVID-19, climate change, threat from new and emerging technologies, ecosystem collapse, food security, etc. Although the WTO relies on a highly qualified secretariat, it is a member-driven organization, and these obstacles must be addressed by the members. Simultaneously, at the regional level, nations keep taking steps towards further integration. Asian countries have pursued integration in various trade agreements. For example, China and Japan have already negotiated 24 FTAs respectively. At the regional level, within Asian countries, we can find the Asia-Pacific Trade Agreement, the APTA, the South Asian Free Trade Agreement, SAFTA, the ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand, and of course the RCEP. Asian countries are also expanding trade negotiations with other regions, such as the Americas and now the UK, with the CPTPP. The newly appointed Director General, Dr. Nonsi Okonjo-Iweala, noted that the organization needs to look for a sense of purpose, as well as to work and perceive itself in a global context without ignoring long-term and sustainable goals. For the WTO to make the greatest contribution possible to the progress of sustainable development goals, it will need deep reform to revitalize the rules-based system. This will only be possible to achieve through an intensive level of cooperation among all members and stakeholders. In this fourth global webinar, speakers will present their views on how to revitalize the WTO rules-based system for addressing global challenges with an Asian perspective. Presenters will be guided aiming to find responses to the following questions. What are the global challenges that have impacted and will impact the most in your region? How can the WTO rules-based system address these challenges? What are the missing elements to strengthen the rules-based system that the WTO would need to tackle global challenges? Why is the WTO-based rules-based system critical to address these challenges? And how can WTO members of your region revitalize the WTO rules-based system? Against this background, and without further preamble, I would like to give the floor to our speakers. Professor Dr. Hong Zhao, you have the floor.
Good evening, and good morning, and good afternoon. Thank you very much for Luis and Edna to start with the opening session, and for the kind and warm introduction. I'm very glad to join the online workshop on revitalizing the WTO rule-based system to address global challenges from an Asia's perspective. Now, firstly, please allow me to start by paying tribute to the distinguished late Professor John Jackson, who dedicated the whole of his professional life to promoting the rule-based multilateral trading system. We all benefited from his contribution to the design and funding of the World Trade Organization, in particular of its dispute settlement system. It is never too much for all our generation to pay such a tribute to him. He visited China several times, both before and after China's accession to the World Trade Organization. He even provided training to young professionals who were involved in the implementation of China's accession commitment. He's highly respected in China's trade law community. He's admired and beloved by many Chinese scholars and students. Now, personally, I also greatly indebted to him, to his work, which I regularly read and cited while teaching and researching in the field of international trade law and the WTO. I guess he would be much worried and concerned, even very sad, if he knew the current situation of the World Trade Organization. As Edna illustrated just now, since the end of 2020, when I left the appellate body, the major positive progress at the WTO is the election of the new DG, the first women African, Dr. Okonjo-Iweala, and her leadership. Extensive discussions and communications is undertaken for the preparation of the coming ministerial, which is going to be held in late November this year. I wish WTO members a successful ministerial conference with concrete outcome to be achieved by the end of the year, which is much needed by this organization. While there are hopes that some sort of progress in fisheries subsidies and other areas that could be made in the negotiating front, the dispute settlement body has actually been turned into a non-binding one-tier system. The appellate body continued to be non-operative with 14 or 15, even more cases which had been appealed before it that can't be resolved. It is a big question mark how long the system could last, humbling on one leg, its first instance, the panel stage. So wait at the next step, how to move on. This is the reason I'd like to thank the John Jackson Moot Court and Dr. Edna in putting effort to bring us together, to have a dialogue on these issues. And to me, it is essential for the World Trade community to sit down and talk, even virtually. That is the only way that we could walk out of this current impasse. No other magic means. It is no strange that GATT has been mockingly regarded as a general agreement and talk. There's wisdom inside it. So let's start talking and communicate on these matters. Firstly, to facilitate the discussion and for the sake of the rapporteur's work, I will follow the sequence of the issue that Edna provided for this discussion. Firstly, let's look at what are the global challenges that have impacted and will impact most in our region. Obviously, the most severe and serious challenge that is currently plaguing this region is the pandemic. Let me extend the deepest condolences to the lives lost during the pandemic. Now, unlike the financial crisis of 1998 and 2008, whose impact were mostly economic and welfare loss, the pandemic is a health-related crisis, and what is most urgent is about saving lives. It also brings worries of people, affect human life, and cause uncertainty to business and economic activities. This is but another example that why international coordination, collaboration, and leadership are indispensable in confronting any human crisis. Nobody is safe until everyone is safe. I'm glad to see much help is offered to the country and region most they need. And I wish that situation will be under control rather sooner. Another factor I'd like to mention that cause impact in this region is the supply chain uncertainties caused by the big nation rivalry, which mentioned Edna as well in the opening remark. Now, people notice, even in early part of this year, that there's a shortage of the chips for autos, even from the European automakers. Now, this is just example how the so-called measures, the entity list, could impact a certain sector. And not only in this region, but also in other parts of the world. Another factor I would like to mention that have impact on this region is the climate change. And the target has been pledged by major economies on reducing or neutral carbon emission. And there are positive signs that US, China, European Union, and other economies could collaborate in this regard. A greener recovery might be expected in the future in the region in this regard. Though there are challenges to business, I think this also bringing them opportunities and hopes to the people and population in general to this region. Technology advancement, the mode of business, of manufacturing, and the lifestyle will be changed accordingly. But I think it is changing in a more positive direction that could saving this planet. So this is another factor that we might consider that impact this region. The other one I'd like to mention is the cutting edge technologies. There are many so-called 21st century technologies, such as 5Gs, AIs, cloud computing, quantum computing, autopilot, electric automobile, digital currency, digital economy, etc., etc. I think these cutting-edge technologies could also bring into this region both challenges and opportunities. I won't elaborate on this, but these are, I think, are the factors that might bring in impact to this region, either in positive or negative ways. So the next question is that how the Wto rule-based system address these challenges. Now, these challenges, if I'm correctly identified, are crisis or a challenge of a comprehensive and complicated nature. And we believe that the trade rules, the multilateral trade rules, could not be the single measures that could address these challenges. So for me, I think what needs to be made is the comprehensive research and study on what are appropriate approach to address these crises for human beings. Now the trade rules, but WTO do play a role inside it, and mostly in the trade-related manner, the trade-related rules. For example, the pandemic. It is a priority issue at the WTO that many members address it, and there are huge discussions and measures have been taken to remove or lift the trade restrictive measures. So these, for example, the export control on vaccine and the raw material that lead to the manufacturing of a vaccine have been discussed and addressed. I don't know to what extent, how deeply, and what are the national security issue will play a role inside. I'm not within WTO anymore for quite a while. I'm not familiar with that, but I think that is perspective that trade measures could address this pandemic-like crisis of human being. And for supply chain challenges, I guess it's more trade-related as it is mostly investment-driven. Given the trade, 70 to 80% of the world trade is among multinational companies. Investment is a vital element affecting trade. So the trade rules might have will be very relevant to combating the uncertainty of supply chain. So that is a matter that I think can be discussed at World Trade Organization. And there are other, the climate change is another area that the World Trade Organization could address from trade perspective. We heard about the suggestion by European Union about a carbon border tax. And I think for me, they need a general comprehensive discussion on all the aspects of climate change. What kind of rules will be required in the trade organization that could create a leveling field? So there's a need for, it is a standard that will be required to set up to facilitate the trade related with climate change challenge. Is it putting under the environmental goods negotiation? I heard there are suggestions that the environmental goods negotiation should be initiated. So generally, and for digital trade, there are e-commerce discussions. There are discussions on the e-commerce. There are developments, but whether it is enough to address even the trade perspective of digital trade. Now, there are suggestions from European Union, some countries of the European Union on digital tax. So what are the factors should be considered? For me, it is a comprehensive study that should be initiated first before members decide what are the measures or policies or rules that should be designed for the further for creating the leveling field. And what is the missing? The next question in the discussion is what the missing element to strengthen the rule-based system. For me, it is two-front. It is never, someone said it is the negotiating front and the dispute settlement. The negotiating front is setting up rules, making rules, updating the rule book. Though it is difficult, some are going to give it up and said it is too difficult. And they try to focus currently only on dispute settlement. Of course, dispute settlement is important. It is about enforcing rules. Without enforcement, there will be less credibility of the rules. So I think the negotiating front and the dispute settlement front go hand in hand and cannot be, neither of them can be disregarded. There are difficulties. I would say how, from my perspective, how to gear in to improve the difficult issues in the two perspectives later on. But I will go further to say why multilateral rules matters, why it is critical to have multilateral rules. I think that equivalent to why it is critical to have international law, because it is not only trade rules. For me, what I mentioned, the challenges of crisis, they are all the factors that bring in uncertainty. So what suffered by the region and the world alike is the uncertainty caused by these challenges or crises. And the multilateral trading rules or international law, the rule-based system, is about removing uncertainty and producing predictability and security. That is why the rule-based system matters and is critical and is indispensable. And for me, that is the highlight of human civilization. It is the software, that human beings could achieve so much materialism achievement. So that is obvious. I think that is obvious. But what is happening currently is that this rule-based system is being threatened. It is in danger. That is why we should pay attention to it. And for me, this region, in my view, this region is much more has particularities that there's a reason for this region to support multilateralism and take responsibility. Why? Among the uncertainties of the element I mentioned that form the challenges to this region, there are something that is certain or more certain than otherwise. That is, if this region enjoys the size of the economy, the rising demand, the rising of the middle class, the high saving rate, the well-educated and self-disciplined population, skilled and diligent workers, and the business-friendly environment to attract foreign investment. That is why last year it witnessed the highest growth of FDI inflow to this region. So for me, this region should take more responsibility to promote multilateralism, to support the strengthening and improving of multilateral rules. But whether it is the sense that there's a lack of sense of duty for this region, or it is the lack of capacity, is an issue to be discussed. We may have some questions in that regard, and we can have further discussions. So in conclusion, in my view, this planet Earth or the human being somehow is in crisis mode. There are many challenges to human being, to mankind in general. Not only pandemic, environment, the climate change, threat, the financial market, you see the bubbles, and there are many, not only one, and nobody could address, not even one international organization could address the single crisis. So there is a shared future and shared fate of all human beings. It is the village urge, the Earth village, and the shared international community that people should be together. So for me, what to suggest, I think it is about changing the mentality, whether there should be more collaboration or more rivalry. So what we can do, I think the way we come to today, to this current situation of the civilization we could achieve, is because of the collaboration. International law is but a tool to create the framework that peace and security could be maintained. And based on that peace and security, collaborations, trust collaborations could be created, and the material achievement could be accomplished. That is why we could have development. There's still rooms. I think the trade area is unlike other areas. We have some rules. We have this rule-based system, but it has been, for a while, has been sidelined. How to make it more relevant, still be the focus. It's an issue that we should think about it, and for me, it is about mentality. Now, regionalization, the RTA-FTA play a role. Of course, it's not the best. It could be a second best means to have further integration for countries in the region. But the best is still multilateral rules. That is the most cost-effective ways to have collaborations. Then what is the way to build trust and have that collaboration? It is the mindset of equality among nations. Everyone is equal. Every nation, big or small, are equal. Mutual respect is the basis for mutual collaboration. Regardless of what is the mode of its development, what is the cultural heritage, I think only when people could collaborate. The collaborate is better than fighting with each other. No, blaming each other is the worst. The Chinese believe to govern a nation is like govern a big nation is like cooking a little fish. So everything started from neighborhoods, from yourself, how you deal with the relation with others, on individual basis. Now, we were taught from our young that you should identify and look at others' merits and find and look at your own shortcoming. That is the way you deal with the relationship. That is the way you maintain collaboration and solidarity, forming solidarity among individuals. It is the same among nations. I think I'm exceeding my time limit, and I would like to stop here. That we could have, we could come back for more questions. I think I didn't even address the issue of appellate body on this settlement, but for me, the more important thing is about mentality setting, how you see the world, how you see the relationship. Now, international law is about defining rights, obligations, and dealing with relationship among nations. I think that is the starting point. When we have that, everything could be started. Technically, I don't think set up rules is that difficult, even combating climate change or supply chain shifting or whatever. So I stop there, and I will leave time for others. Thank you
very much. Certainly, you will get questions from regarding the issue of the appellate body and the dispute settlement system. We know where we are now, and I'm sure you have a very interesting view on seeing how we can make progress on that aspect. Now, I would like to give, but thank you very much for expanding your vision on the other issues regarding the current challenges that the WTO is facing and how they can be solved. Now, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Penelope Ridings.
Good evening, good morning, and good afternoon. I'd like to first thank the organizers for this fourth global webinar for the John Jackson Moot. I'm very honored to join the other panelists in this webinar. I want to say first that the views that I'm going to express are my own personal views, but I want to also join Professor Zhao in paying tribute to the late Professor John Jackson, who contributed so much to international trade law and its scholarship. So I want to address the global challenges facing the world today. I believe that all WTO members have a role to play in ensuring a more economically prosperous world in which everyone can gain from the benefits of international trade. It goes without saying that dealing with COVID-19 is the most pressing and most challenging issue facing the world today. We are witnessing a massive loss of human life and human potential, which is continuing unabated. We have the prospect of vaccines, but it will still take some time before the world returns to some semblance of normalcy. We have witnessed the impact of COVID-19 on international trade, particularly the decline in services and the adverse impact on global supply chains. To put it in context, the economic downturn in 2020 was the worst peacetime global contraction since the Great Depression. And according to the WTO, the value of world merchandise exports fell by 8% in 2020, and services fell by 20%. While trade is expected to recover to some extent in 2021, there will be a continuing challenge in dealing with the trade-related aspects of COVID. And while we must address the pandemic and its toll on human life, there are also longer-term questions which also have to be addressed. These include making international trade more equitable and more inclusive, addressing the trade-related aspects of environmental protection, and dealing appropriately with technological innovation and digital connectivity. A global challenge is how to make international trade more equitable and more inclusive. The benefits of international trade must reach all developing and least developed countries. Countries can't be left behind in the economic recovery, which we hope will come in the aftermath of COVID-19. In short, in order to ensure the credibility of the international trading system, the benefits of international trade must reach all peoples of the world. Another challenge is how to ensure that international trade can facilitate the global environment so that it benefits the planet as a whole. This includes making sure that trade policies do not harm the environment. And as Professor Zhao has also said, climate change is the greatest long-term threat faced globally. The world must be prepared to meet trade-related challenges of climate change, but without recourse to protectionism. The final challenge I want to identify is how to ensure that everyone, from the largest corporations to the smallest business, can participate in the digital economy. COVID has highlighted the role of digital connectivity. We would not be having this webinar if it hadn't been for COVID. And we've seen the rise in digital transactions. The challenge is making sure that they are addressed appropriately. So having considered the challenges, I will turn now to how the WTO rules-based system can help in addressing those challenges. There are a number of specific measures which the WTO could adopt to meet these challenges, which I'll address shortly. But I want to start first by considering more generally the way in which a rules-based system can assist. In my view, it can help to lay the foundations for a global economic recovery. We have seen since the Uruguay round that the WTO agreement has laid the foundations for growth in world trade, enhanced the global economy, and increased economic development and raised living standards. The negotiations under the auspices of the WTO agreement are still of paramount importance. However, we all know that the WTO negotiating framework has been moribund for some more than a decade. And it's led members, including those in the Asian region, to develop free trade agreements and to develop other trade facilitating arrangements between partners. So first, free trade agreements. Since the 2000, regional and bilateral free trade agreements have expanded worldwide in number, scope, and coverage. FTAs offer an additional avenue to advance trade interests beyond the WTO. As the network of trade agreements has grown, all countries are seeking to trade more and to avoid being disadvantaged by the FTAs of their competitors. And of particular importance in the Asian region, as Professor Ramirez-Robles has indicated, is the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. And this covers 16 countries in the region and will help to deepen economic integration in the region. RCEP increases the network of already existing free trade arrangements in the region, but of particular importance is that it is the first free trade agreement between China, Japan, and South Korea. We have to always remember that free trade agreements are based on the principles and in many cases the rules of the WTO agreement. They are underpinned and validated by the WTO agreement. The failure of the WTO negotiations has led to a second development, which is plurilateral agreements between a few or groups of WTO members on particular issues. Plurilaterals are a pragmatic approach that actually allow progress to be made among a group of countries. They have arisen in response to the slow pace of the WTO negotiations and the push from business for more open and effective trade arrangements, which can remove tariff barriers, non-tariff barriers, and can reduce the cost of doing business. A recent example is the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement between Singapore, New Zealand, and Chile. And this agreement promotes paperless trading, faster customs procedures for express shipments, and it supports the growth of e-payments and e-invoicing across borders. There is no consensus among countries of the Asian region on whether joint statement initiatives are appropriate, but they do enable progress to be made among willing WTO members in the absence of any progress being made in the WTO negotiations. So having looked at the ways in which a rules-based system can generally assist meeting these challenges, I want to turn to examining more specifically the missing elements which could strengthen the rules-based system. First, with respect to COVID, we have unfortunately seen recourse to medical supply and vaccine nationalism. But trade must foster and not impede access to medical supplies, equipment, medicines, and vaccines to deal with pandemics. So a missing element from the WTO rules is the elimination of tariffs, non-tariff barriers, and export restrictions on essential medical supplies. This could also include the facilitation of the movement of medical supplies at the border and increasing recourse to streamlined digital processes. A second challenge that I posed was how to make international trade more equitable and more inclusive. Specific efforts need to be made to broaden international trade to include women, small and medium enterprises, and Indigenous entrepreneurs. What is needed is women's economic empowerment and the ability of small businesses to participate in trade more successfully. This can assist in rebuilding after COVID and hopefully ensure a more level playing field in international trade. A third challenge, of course, as I mentioned, is how to enhance and improve the global environment. There's several initiatives underway on this trade environment. Goods and services should be freed up. Harmful fossil fuel subsidies should be eliminated. Fisheries subsidies negotiations should be concluded. And trade and investment in renewable energy and associated services must be facilitated. And the digital economy. I've already mentioned the DIPA, and also the WTO is progressing the e-commerce framework agreement. So all of these can be addressed through the WTO multilateral process. The GATT and WTO were created in order to remove unilateralism. The core principle and central pillar is the principle of non-discrimination. We need to move away from unilateralism and towards multilateralism. And we need to have a broader applicable rules-based system. The Asia-Pacific region can really assist in providing this rules-based system. We need to have a return to consensus as an absence of formal objection. WTO members may not like something, but a member should not be able to veto others if others wish to pursue it. WTO members in the Asian region have a key role to play, but it's important to keep the eye on the prize, a more economically prosperous world where all WTO members and their peoples gain the benefit of international trade. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ridings, for this very illustrative words. Indeed, thank you very much for also highlighting that it is a global challenge indeed to have a more inclusive rule of law state in the world. So thank you very much. And now I would like to give the floor to Michael Ewing.
Thank you, Edna, for inviting me, and thank you for organizing this important panel. First, I'd like to express my deep sympathy and concern for the COVID situation in India. I have many friends, colleagues, and former students who are based in India, and I'm worried about all of them. James, who I'm delighted to see is with us on this panel, is someone I consider to be all three: a friend, a colleague, and a former student. This is a terrible situation, and one that underscores the need for collective action by the global community. I want to talk about the two biggest challenges facing us: COVID and climate change. All the previous speakers have indeed mentioned these as the major challenges, and I agree with them and what they have said about it. I also believe that the WTO should be an important actor in our fight against the problems created by these challenges. Now, WTO and trade rules have been instrumental since the GATT days in mobilizing market-based responses to shortages and incentivizing innovations to meet our needs. We need this WTO legal technology and institutional infrastructure more than ever before to deal with this twin existential crisis. Allow me to share with you a personal story that sort of illustrates this. I was invited in 2011 to try to help solve some of the food crisis problems in Asia, and I'll explain to you how that came about. In April 2008, the price of rice jumped from about $250 US per metric ton to about $1,100 per metric ton in just 1 month, the month of April. While bad weather affected rice harvests, the main trigger was that certain countries imposed export restrictions. India actually imposed export restrictions on rice, except for basmati, and China and Thailand were reported to be considering doing so. Because rice is a thinly traded commodity, this led to a scramble by individual countries to secure for themselves enough supply of a major staple food for Asian economies. This caused the price of rice to rise 400 to 500% in just 1 month. The UN Special Reporter on the Right to Food, Oliver de Schutter, argued that WTO trade disciplines overly restricted WTO members' domestic policies and prevented them from ensuring food security by limiting subsidies and preventing them from privileging domestic production. This is a common argument. He argued that the right to food should prevail over the WTO rules. Then WTO Director General Pascal Lamy responded that this was not the case, as there was actually enough flexibility in the WTO disciplines to provide policy space, and that indeed trade was the solution to limited food supply. In this argument, I believe former Director General Lamy was right. Today we face a collective action problem played out not just within arbitrary geographical boundaries or borders, but on a planetary scale across entire global commons. Beyond food concerns, we are faced with two even more concerning and urgent existential crises, both of which could contribute to food insecurity, but are themselves far bigger threat. But we can learn some lessons from how ASEAN, China and Japan and South Korea, what is known as ASEAN +3, responded to the 2008 price of rice spike. I was asked to resolve some issues for the negotiators. They were having an impasse in the negotiations in 2011, and the Asian Development Bank asked me to act as legal counsel to resolve the deadlock. So there were three main issues. First, some APTIA members, the ASEAN +3 Emergency Rice Reserve members, wanted the rice reserve to only include rice from outside of Asia, and others wanted to include only rice within Asia for the virtual stockpile. The auspicious reason both sides gave made some sense. They wanted to either supplement production or to encourage internal within the ASEAN +3 region domestic production. But of course, we all know that it could be interest captured. Some of them may be trying to use up their obligatory rice purchase stockpiles from the US, EU, and Australia. And for other members which were growing rice within the region, arguing for internal rice production would allow them to subsidize domestic farmers a little bit more. As all APTIA members were WTO members, I was able to tell them that origin non-neutral rice policy would be probably in breach of the WTO obligations, and an origin non-neutral rice policy could not be excused by GATT Article 20 unless they could show why the origin of rice was necessary, and that I personally could not see how it could be so justified. Another APTIA issue was the price of rice. Some APTIA members wanted to fix the price of rice. The argument was that APTIA was meant to deal with sudden price spikes, and therefore a fixed price would help it. The problem with this, it was that it could create a subsidy, which could be an export subsidy, if the price of rice actually dropped below this fixed price. I suggested instead that to deal with the spikes, a series of future contracts could be developed with APTIA members to forecast shortfalls so that a floating average of the monthly rice price could be created so that you would not prevent increases, but you would soften the effects of sudden increases. This, of course, required the creation and monitoring and information sharing system to determine if matches or shortfalls be made within the APTIA system. This is difficult because it requires members to tell other members what they predict the demand and supply to be, and to be ready to work together to alleviate shortfalls. But it is being done in Bangkok and Manila by economists and data scientists. Finally, this will also require members to agree, and this is the most important one, to work together to meet demands from their population. The 2008 rice crisis was triggered by export restrictions or the threat of export restrictions, creating a scenario where speculators sensing an opportunity engage in profiteering. Now, speculation is not the cause, but only a symptom. For every trade, there must be a buyer and a seller. Now, no country in the event of a rice shortage would agree to be prohibited from enacting export restrictions. Hungry people are angry people, and few politicians will be in agreement with full export of rice. However, you can encourage them to have a minimum export amount so that you're essentially saving in a virtual stockpile like a virtual bank account. If you have more than you need, save it down there, give it to other members. Now, this brings us to climate change and the problem of self-sufficiency. We cannot deal with shortages on a self-sufficiency basis. Saudi Arabia for many years tried to be self-sufficient by making the desert bloom with crops. After spending close to US $80 billion a year to do so, they gave up. It never provided them enough because they simply do not have water. Similarly, you can imagine how Singapore would fail if we tried to plant rice in Singapore. There are better ways of doing it, and we can provide better services and goods rather than planting rice. No one country can predict with certainty the amount of production in any area anymore because of climate change. Using a strategy based on national boundaries fails to recognize that rain falls or fails to fall on the just and unjust equally. Weather, like the virus, does not recognize borders. It cannot be solved by self-sufficiency, but rather by collective action. We need to work together to prevent what is essentially a global problem. The WTO provides enough policy space, but actually also provides a virtuous discipline that clarifies policies and prevents self-interested entities from attempting to subvert food security arguments in favor of certain vested interests. Therefore, even though we need to build resilience in the system, we need to move from self-sufficiency to collective security. The COVID pandemic highlights the gaps in our current global cooperative infrastructure. We recognize that if we prevent any domestic transmission of disease, even in Singapore, as we almost did, no country is island entire to itself, not even Singapore. On 27th of April, Bloomberg ranked Singapore as the best place to be during this pandemic. The very next day, we had a very worried outbreak because some cases broke through our triple barriers: vaccinated frontlines, testing regimes, and a 14-day strictly enforced quarantine. It's speculated that Indian double mutant variant may be the reason for our failures at our borders. Very clearly, just as Singapore cannot ever be self-sufficient with food, Singapore cannot concern itself only with the pandemic within its borders. Just as weather and climate, this virus does not respect arbitrary lines on a map. We need better systems to coordinate our efforts for collective security. And illustrated by the Biden administration moving towards a more internationalist approach in its rhetoric after it took over. However, continuing some of the self-sufficiency policies of the former administration so as to send the message that fighting this pandemic would be focused at home first. Fatally, this caused a problem. The export restrictions on vaccines and related raw materials meant that vaccine shortages in India occurred, and it's a race now between vaccination and infection. Fortunately, on the 26th of April, the Biden administration changed and lifted export restrictions, sending raw materials for vaccines, medical equipment, and protective gear to India. Since it has more Pfizer-Moderna vaccines than it needs, it also promised to share some of its stockpiles of AstraZeneca vaccines as soon as possible. But now you can see how a system like the APTIA pre-agreed minimum thresholds could actually create a situation where we could monitor things, share our resources better, and therefore using a data dissemination pandemic rapid response hub with a minimum threshold of resource sharing, more lives could be saved, more immediate threats could be met, and fewer deadly variants could be allowed to mutate and spread, not just in India, but across the world. Such a hub will require all of us, the WTO, the WHO, and the international community to coordinate expertise, but it can be done. Rather than only think about situations within our border, the recognition that every bell that tolls for each one of us should inspire us to restructure our trading system around collective action for existential global issues like the pandemic and climate change. Nonetheless, let us not forget the value of a rule-based system in preventing interest-captured institutions from disguising protectionism as health concerns or green concerns, what we could call greenwashing. The WTO rules and dispute settlement system has created a pretty good transparent system that requires members to rationally justify measures and to cooperate in good faith, encouraged by such transparency and rationality. It has a system to propose and negotiate new rules, such as the 2003 IP waiver, which allowed exemption from IP rights, allowing poor countries affected by serious infectious diseases, such as AIDS, to import generic drugs if they could not make them themselves. It is not a perfect system, but what is? While we all believe the TRIPS agreement could be improved, it's important to bear in mind that without the guarantee of IP protection, it would have been much more difficult to mobilize the capital and resources needed to create the COVID vaccines in such a short space of time. Now, we know that India and South Africa have raised the issue of additional WTO IP waivers for the vaccines beyond the compulsory licensing of generic drug exception. It is being discussed under the WTO, and serious consideration is being given in the world's capital. It is important to consider this. But it's not IP rights at the moment that's preventing access to the vaccines. The first few vaccines are mRNA, and the few facilities can manufacture these cutting-edge vaccines are already operating at full capacity. Now, some of the more traditional vaccine manufacturing capacities are almost at maximum as well. And the excess issue is more that some countries are hoarding vaccines and others do not have enough money to buy them. The big pharma companies currently are not charging more than costs, but some countries just don't have the money to pay for them. In the meantime, while we work towards this, it's important to get a balance between IP rights so as to incentivize innovation and the need to provide access to vaccines so as to many people as possible, especially in poorer developing countries, get them. We do need to have better rules regarding compulsory licensing, waivers for the import of generics, and procedures to change the rules if necessary. Now, we should start with them currently and refine them in the months and years to come in order to balance concern. While it is true that this pandemic will hopefully end soon, we will face a longer-term problem of climate change, and the rules will be needed to incentivize the innovation for green tech, ensure that access is not blocked for green technology, and that we have systems to ensure equitable distribution of that technology. Now, what can we do? Even as we socially distance during this terrible time, we need ever more to be interconnected. We need to have systems in place that will allow us to manage our own problems, yet recognize we are all interconnected and must find a way to share our extra resources. The WHO COVAX initiative, in which rich countries can donate to buy vaccines for countries, that's a good start. In time, each country with more vaccines in their stockpiles must consider what it should do with the stockpiles. We need to enunciate this need to move from self-sufficiency to collective security with regard to this. We'll need to figure out how to deal with climate change on a similar paradigm. Rather than merely championing national producers and raising barriers against foreign producers, we need cooperative mechanisms like an environmental goods agreement, IP waivers, and even minimum guarantees on limiting export restrictions, as well as data sharing and transparency to deal with this bigger crisis. The lesson from food security is that studies have shown that even with climate change affecting food production, there will always be potentially enough, because some regions, like the currently frozen tundras of the north, with global warming will be able to produce more food. The WTO system is very good at increasing the production of manufactured goods because the efficiency created by the trading system. A similar reduction of barriers for agricultural products, the COVID vaccines and therapeutics, as well as in the future green goods, will also be part of a solution for this crisis. The problem is not so much a production problem, but a distribution problem. The WTO needs to build on its current system of transparency and rational discussion to create an environment of trust and cooperation so as to address that distribution problem. We need to move from a system of efficiency maximization to one designed to also encourage equitable distribution based on enlightened self-interest and a recognition that these global crises are not solvable by self-sufficiency, but only by collective security. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Professor Ewing Chong, it is a brilliant presentation, and that you allowed us to see other aspects that are not always taken into account and that they're critical, such as the food security issue. Thank you very much also for the words regarding India's situation. Indeed, everyone in the world is concerned about it, and as you rightly said, only through a collaborative approach this can be reduced. So now I would like to give the floor to Dr. Mohammed Saeed.
Good day from sunny but slightly chilly Geneva. Let me start by thanking organizer and especially Edna. My gratitude also go to Professor Jackson. I'm fortunate to personally benefit from his expertise while I tenure at Harvard Law School or at the WTO as a negotiator. Small disclaimer that what I'm going to present is my personal views, so not to be attributed to the organization I serve or even the region or the country I belong to. In my talk, I'll try to address all the 5 questions which have been shared by the organizers, starting with challenges, then combining the question 2 and 4, that why and how WTO can address these challenges. I will also share the missing elements to strengthen the WTO, and in closing, what the WTO members of this region can contribute to revitalize the WTO. Let me start with the challenges. Because I anticipated that I will be the 4th speaker in the series. So if you notice, and I'm sure you would notice, the absence of COVID and climate change, please give me the credit that I anticipated well that my learned predecessor speaking before me would be talking about it. I will, for this purpose, I have picked, there are many, but I have picked 4 challenges. The first, we need to see the Asia being the largest continent, the biggest producer of goods, being the most populous and providing the largest consumer base, house to the largest trading nation, and outside Africa, house to the LDCs and LLDCs, is a unique region. Except for ASEAN region, which is a sub-region within Asia, the intra-regional trade is relatively low. There has been individual brilliant examples, not necessarily very well coordinated. And despite momentous achievements by bringing out of poverty hundreds of millions of people in this region, still this region houses the most number of poor people. And this manifests my first challenge, and that is the inequality amongst and within countries. Secondly, the global geopolitical and geostrategic relations are in a flux. The realignment of geostrategic interest is being reset. If I may use this expression, this region is at the epicenter of it. The struggle for global leadership and hegemony is so strong that is impacting every walk of life, and trade is not an exception. So Geneva, the seat of the WTO or the multilateralism, cannot afford to remain oblivious to this. The challenge is how and to what extent economic and trade relations and the landscape can be insulated from broader struggle of political hegemony. Thirdly, traditionally the East Asian regions and the countries have more established integrated supply chains over the decades. There is a tendency amongst companies, and especially the MNCs, to produce closer to the consumer market, the sentiment of shortening the supply chain. The recent pandemic has further accentuated that trend. I'm not saying regionalization of supply chain is bad per se. What I'm saying is that the challenge is how this regional phenomena, also including the FTAs and the RTAs, can be managed into the building blocks for the global good. This brings me to the last challenge, and that is that the international trade rules, in contrast with the yesteryears, are more focused on upward regulatory convergence, establishing the new global standards. More and more focus is on uptake of technology advancement and control, and 5G is the perfect case in point. These 3 phenomena combined, like technology, advancement and control, regionalization, and struggle for political hegemony, if not managed well, has the potential to further muddy the water. The apprehension regarding duality of standards, especially in the field of technology, is palpable. Certainly, this is not a good omen for the multilateral cooperation and coordination challenges how to address and manage this. Now let me come to why and how the WTO can address these challenges. By exclusion, WTO is the only platform for multilateral collaboration for trade. And during the past 25 years, it has established its credibility to transform and regulate economic and trade relations through principle of non-discrimination, open and transparent trade rules. Specificity in the sense that some rules like subsidies can only be agreed at the multilateral level. It can't be at the regional level. Through its review and monitoring mechanism, especially during the 2008 financial crisis, this has provided the insurance guarantee against protectionist sentiment. It has helped and has the potential to restrain economic nationalism, and it has proven that the organization is resilient and resourceful. The SU, despite recent setbacks, has positively contributed towards predictability and stability of the system. It has proven that it's not economic or mercantilist might which makes it right, rather the rule of law which guarantees that right is might. So, before discussing how we can revitalize or strengthen the WTO system, let's see a bit of the history so far for the WTO and the multilateralism. And I, primarily being a trained medical doctor, I'm trained that first make the diagnosis before prescribing the treatment. So I will be trying to do a bit of the diagnosis before going there. Let's start from the 1995. The sentiment of globalization and liberalization was high. Freer trade as a result of non-discrimination, open and transparent rules was considered, and rightly so, best tool for job creation and global prosperity. The benefit did materialize, but not necessarily were evenly distributed for a member or different sector within one member. At that point of time, the negotiation was steered by Quad countries, one from this region. And if I take it, and I tend to agree that some commentators even said about the Uruguay round that it primarily multilateralized the US and EU trade and economic relations with certain add-on for other members and the developing countries. In 2001, we saw two landmark developments. One was the launch of the Doha Room for further liberalization and better rules. And even bigger was the entry of China in the WTO. The Doha Round got so much importance and visibility that it became synonymous with the WTO. The negotiation process moved from Quad to the G5, and again, two from this region. At the time of Uruguay Round, single undertaking was considered a recipe for success. Currently, some informed commentators even go on to say that it is a liability. The priorities and realities have changed over the last 25 years. This can be easily understood if I give you an example of the selection of the WTO DG for the last 3 successive DGs. In 2004, the common thread amongst all the candidates aspiring to be the WTO DG was that I have necessity wherewithal to complete the Doha Round. When we came to 2012, at the time of Roberto, it was that I have necessary training and potential to salvage the Doha Round. And now in the 2020, it was to salvage the WTO. Future of the WTO and WTO for the future was this, I would say, banner heartland for all the DGs. So this is where we stand, and now how can this be revitalized? Let's start with the first one. The realities of international trade have changed over last quarters, and the rule book has not been updated. WTO is outdated. Some may say broken, but certainly not dead. The process has excessive, I would say, complexity and excruciating sluggishness as a negotiating forum. TRIPS and public health, as was mentioned by other colleagues, and trade facilitation agreement are the two outstanding achievements during this period, which are worth replicating. Secondly, the diversity of membership and complexity of issues has been increasing and will continue to do so. In my view, the era of trade round is over, and sooner we realize it, the better it is. It might not be easy now to go and negotiate the ironclad agreement. In the past, we experienced this in the GATT by the positive list approach of the GATT's commitment and the trade facilitation agreement, that there is more, which is the flexibility of taking on the obligation, extent and timing of the commitment, which is in accordance with your implementation capacity, and which can be further strengthened by the technical assistance and capacity building promises. So the future to me is of agreement with not with capital A, but small a, the framework agreement, which provides this flexibility to its members. The so-called 21st century issues like investment facilitation, MISMEs, digital trade, domestic regulations are already being discussed. WTO needs to internalize this concept of variable geometry. In other words, the plurilateral approach should be considered complementing the multilateral agenda. GPA and ITA are the good examples to follow. The collation of interested and willing is the name of the game from now onwards, in my view. The caution needs to be exercised that those are driven with the intention of inclusivity rather than exclusivity. I also mentioned regionalism and RTAs. No doubt these are permissible under the WTO law. The WTO must realize and work how these can be multilateralized, how these can be opened for the non-members, how regional benchmarks and regulatory space can be multilateralized. If I see the accumulation of rules of origin under different agreements, as well as the non-party MFN clause in different service agreement, are the successful examples and novel ideas which can be explored. Coming to the DSU, DSU has served the membership for 25 years and served well. It was considered to be the jewel of the crown. There is a need to revive the AB, that goes without saying, as it has provided predictability and security for the systems and contributed towards winning the confidence and trust of its members. But 2 points I must flag. One, we all know that text of the WTO agreement are negotiated by diplomats, accepting invariably the constructive ambiguity to forge consensus. Over-legalization of dispute resolution has its side effects, and we need to be mindful of that. Secondly, judicial activism or gap filling have not been considered appropriate by some of the members, because according to them, it goes beyond what the negotiator agreed in the Uruguay round, and I tend to agree to that. But at the same time, we forget that WTO negotiator at the time of the Uruguay round also provided an institutional mechanism of authoritative interpretation of the legal text, which is, of course, to clarify the existing commitment. If you need amendment or change, then you need to negotiate. And that authoritative interpretation is going to be applicable to all members, in contrast with outcome or report of any appellate body, which should be primarily remain to the litigants. This needs serious considerations and how it can strengthen the systems. This brings me that how the member of this region can play their role. And the first thing is that they must be participating actively and effectively. It's a reality, and we must internalize it, that no agreement would succeed as 2 out of the G5 who are still in the negotiation process come from this region. I'm convinced that WTO revival is less of a technical or legal issue. Expertise is in abundance, and I have seen during the last 1 hour listening to my colleagues here, and I'm sure this is also your experience. The issue is about the political will and the commitment. The member of this region, especially the big 2, must show leadership in delivering rather than demanding. Equally reciprocated by the other big 3. We have an obligation to work towards, and one of my colleagues talked about the mindset for the shared prosperity, especially for those who are less privileged among us. The economy must be made to serve the humanity rather than nationality. And that way we can go towards the global goodness. Before closing, let me say that the stage is set. The G5 who are supposed to and should steer the negotiation are very well complemented by the current DG, who comes from Africa. So it is the whole continent which is covered. And this is the most comprehensive and well-representative set of leaders who can deliver. And the first test is the upcoming ministerial, which is coming towards end of this year, to send this message to all the members that WTO is back on right track and ready to serve not only the membership, but the mankind. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Said. It is indeed, we all know that the issue of political will, it's going to be the game changer in this situation. So thank you very much for highlighting it and for highlighting the other realities that we have seen, that we are facing, and the need, the extreme need that the WTO has to be modernized and to be revamped. So now I will give the floor to Dr. James Nedumpara.
So thank you, Edna. Thank you, Luis. And thank you all the esteemed participants. I'm extremely delighted to be part of this panel. And also my kudos to all the participants in the ELSA competition, in the John Jackson competition. I think it is such a great privilege and a great opportunity to be part of this competition. I have been involved in this competition for almost a decade. So congratulations to everyone who participated in the competition, and also to the John Jackson Academic Board, and also to Edna for organizing this. So we are now talking about the revitalizing the WTO rule-based system. And this discussion has got an Asian perspective. So if you look at Asia, we know that Asia has been a very minor or a relatively inconsequential and insignificant participant in the multilateral trading system. Most of the Asian countries didn't have anything to export for a major part of the last century. But in the new century, or maybe after 1990, most of the Asian countries are major export hubs. They play a major role in international trade, and they also play an extremely important role in norm setting. So given that context, I think when we look at India, when we look at the entire Asian region, the participation of this region cannot be second to anyone. So given that context, I feel involving the academicians and practitioners from the Asian region in a discussion on revitalizing the WTO is not only timely, but it is extremely important as well. So when we think about some of the issues which the WTO is grappling at the moment, being an academic, I have got some flexibilities which judges and former appellate body members may not have. So my own feeling is that the WTO at the moment is actually facing maybe a crippling kind of a crisis. And most of us have been talking about the crisis, mainly with respect to the dispute settlement body. And we are also absolutely familiar with the crisis with respect to the negotiating arm. A lot of people said that it has been the fairly inactive work or the fairly inactive, I think, performance of the negotiating arm, which actually led to the crisis in the dispute settlement arm. But when we think about the crisis, we have to admit the fact that the appellate body became almost dysfunctional on the 10th of December 2019. And prior to that, there has been significant amount of discussion. David Walker has been involved with that. And many suggestions, very concrete suggestions have been raised by various WTO members, by European Union, India, many other countries, in fact, for solving the impasse at the WTO dispute settlement body. But the fact is that nearly 1.5 years have actually gone by. And in the meantime, some of the ad hoc mechanisms have come into effect. So the one thing that is fairly unsure at the moment, whether we will have the jewel in the crown back. And if you're unable to actually get the jewel in the crown back, then of course the WTO will only have a diminished role. And it doesn't have to be resaid that the agreement is only as good as its enforcement. And there is also a problem. I think the problem is that most of the disputes which have been filed in the last 1.5 years, they're not actually ripe for implementation or enforcement. And once the enforcement issues come up, we can actually anticipate a number of problems, mainly with respect to developed countries and also within developing countries, because sometimes some countries may actually fire an appeal into the void. And some people may say that, some countries are actually filing as if there is an appellate body. But the reality is that the provisions of the dispute settlement understanding is very much intact. So it is extremely important for the entire WTO membership, irrespective of the size or the share of the trade or the kind of interest they have, to get back the appellate body. The multi-boundary interim arbitration mechanism is a good idea in the short run. But too much of focus on this particular idea in the long run can actually lead to the stakeholders losing interest in repairing the WTO dispute settlement system. The appellate body may not even come back. So these are actually, I don't want to paint a very disappointing picture, but at the same time, if concrete actions are not taken at the right time, then perhaps the jewel in the crown will not be back. So now let me also come back to the second issue. So far I have been talking about the dispute settlement issue. Now let us actually get back to the negotiating issue. So when it comes to the negotiating issue, I think some of the speakers in the panel, and of course there is a major debate outside, that the plurilateral approach is the way forward. In fact, the plurilateral approach is not a new approach. It was tried and tested during the Tokyo round. And the single undertaking, as Mr. Said mentioned, has been one of the major hallmarks of the WTO. But there is a realization somewhere that the single undertaking or consensus-based approach actually presents an insurmountable difficulty to having comprehensive agreements signed. So the plurilateral agreements are actually being proposed as a solution. The real issue in this regard is whether the plurilateral agreements can actually contribute to the multilateral trading system, or will the plurilateral agreements be the nail in the coffin? Or will the WTO system actually disintegrate or may become something similar to the Tokyo round agreements, which were enforced during the 1980s and early part of the 1990s. So it is actually a very important issue which the collective membership will have to discuss in an extremely serious manner. Let me also point out here that the very concept of a plurilateral agreement is not an unacceptable idea. That idea is very much there in the WTO agreement. But the important principle is that the plurilateral agreement should be inserted or added into the WTO agreement through the consensus, through explicit consensus. So the consensus is actually the key thing. And without that consensus, it will be even very difficult to actually agree on plurilaterals. But at the same time, I also agree with the suggestion made by some of the panelists that we have to come up with the novel approaches. And since we have got 164 members in the WTO, it is anyone's guess that it is not a perfect system. It is a highly imperfect system that way because of the sheer size of the organization. So within that, it is absolutely possible to find out novel solutions. But I'm not that optimistic at this moment about the success of plurilateral negotiations without getting the consensus of the entire WTO membership. I will just mention maybe one illustration that is actually the domestic regulation in the field of services. So people who are familiar with the services agreement know that there is actually a clear mandate in Article 6.4 of the GATS about developing disciplines on domestic regulation. So the reference is actually to multilateral disciplines. So at the moment, we have got some kind of a plurilateral or joint statement initiative happening in that area. And it is possible that the outcome of the negotiation may be introduced through voluntary commitments or maybe as additional commitments inserted in the schedule of concessions of every WTO member, or maybe who are parties to the plurilateral initiative. It is not actually a very good way of doing it. So to the extent possible, when multilateral consensus can be achieved in certain areas, I think it should be the focus of the WTO membership to explore the possibility of multilateral negotiations. The other important issue, so one major initiative is actually the one on electronic commerce. So we know that, again, there was actually a decision in 1998 with respect to the imposition of customs duty on electronically traded products. We are still having a discussion whether the moratorium should continue or not on that matter. So, and we also know that electronic commerce will actually be the engine of trade in the future. It will be the most substantial part of trade in the future. So it is still an important issue whether the best approach to deal with the digital economy is actually a plurilateral approach. Most of the people who are part of the discussions or who may be listening to this discussion know that once the plurilateral agreement is actually signed, although it provides an opportunity for outside members to join on a voluntary basis or to join this agreement or accede to the agreements at a later point in time, they will not be able to set the terms of the agreement. And secondly, they will have to accept the agreements with a maybe greater responsibility or greater obligations. So that is actually a major challenge. So here, I think the WTO membership will have to pay some kind of an attention to the difference between various categories of plurilateral initiatives. On the one hand, we have got the information technology agreement. That agreement was dealing purely with the reduction of customs duties, mainly with respect to countries who may be trading in these products, and then extending the benefits on an MFN basis. It is fairly, straightforward and simple because it doesn't have any major disciplines. But when it comes to an important area like electronic commerce, then it requires a significant amount of consideration, a significant amount of deliberation as to whether this is the right approach. So Mr. Said also mentioned that in the discussion that, the future may not be of the big, single undertaking agreements, or, sometimes you have to come up with the novel approaches. I completely agree with that point of view. But at the same time, we also know that most of the WTO agreements are actually ironclad agreements. Once you join the agreement, it is very difficult to, backtrack on that agreement. I don't think that any country has really left the WTO. And secondly, as we know in the context of the goods or the services commitments, even to go for a renegotiation of these commitments is very difficult. You have to give compensatory concessions in certain areas. The discussions will take a long period of time. The certification can even take more time. So it is a fairly complex exercise. So that is why whenever we negotiate an agreement of substance and of a magnitude and complexity like electronic commerce, perhaps I think the members will have to think twice whether the plurilateral approach is the right way to go. And the third important issue is that, if you actually go for a plurilateral negotiation without the support and the consensus of the entire WTO membership, there is actually a danger that some of the undesirable or some of the potentially controversial issues can get into the WTO agenda. So it can be sometimes comparative neutrality. trade and environment is definitely one area. So we know that some of these issues are actually best left to other forums like the climate change agreement. And whenever there is some kind of an interface between trade and maybe trade and environment or trade and climate change for that matter, using trade instruments to resolve this climate change problems can at times be a bit problematic. So we know, I mean, all of us know that the non-trade concerns or the process and production method, discussion in the GATT was an extremely controversial issue, and PPMs were actually out of the GATT discussions during the Uruguay round. So if we have to really bring back, the discussion on climate change mitigation through trade-related measures, we have to be extremely careful that some of these controversial areas are not included within the agreement. So that is why sometimes it may be important to come up with other categories of measures in order to achieve climate change objectives. For instance, transfer of technology. So most of in many of the developing countries, I think the major problem is that they do not have the technology. So once the technology is actually given to those countries, in many situations, they can offer better technology. And in the context of the bigger economies, of course, there has to be a big commitment. Of course, President Biden has been doing a remarkable work in the last 1 or 2 months with respect to climate change initiatives. And the European Union has been also going ahead with the Green Deal. So these are all possible, very positive things. But at the same time, I would like to mention that one has to take into account the interest of the entire WTO membership. Another point, I think if I have the time, I just wanted to mention about another important issue, which is actually, the development dimension of the WTO agreement. So now the WTO agreements have completed 25 years. We know that most of the special and differential provisions within the WTO do not have much of meaning at the moment, because those kind of concessions were given with respect to compliance of the obligations. But in relation to new agreements, the important issue is whether special and differential treatment should be given due consideration, and if it were to be given due consideration, in what manner it should be given. So, the one important negotiation that we are seeing at the moment is actually the Fisheries Negotiation. It is absolutely possible to have a case-by-case approach with respect to incorporating special and differential provisions within these new negotiations. But at the same time, one has to also look at the size of the country, the population in the country, the amount of poverty in the country. The economic size itself may not be a pure indicator of the development status of a country. So these are all important issues. And I should also mention that when we have got a very, very difficult issue, it is better to discuss that issue. So we are now going through the pandemic. Many countries are actually turning protectionist, not because they want to, but they want to conserve and preserve some of their essential supplies. So every country has to actually take care of their own population. And for these reasons, sometimes they may come up with an export restriction on rice or maybe on medical supplies. And these countries cannot be faulted, because if they do not do so, huge amount of domestic opposition will happen. So that is why there is an extremely important need in order to understand the domestic dynamics in most of these countries. So what I would like to end saying that the WTO is definitely the most important organization. The Asian countries play an extremely important role in the WTO negotiation, as well as in the dispute settlement item. But at the same time, most of the Asian economies are still developing economies. So the development dimension has to be there. And at the same time, technology has to be given to some of these economies. And if the Asian economies are able to leverage from trade, then it will be good for the world. So let me stop here, and thank you, Elsa, again for giving me an opportunity.
On the opposite, thank you very much. You're definitely bringing up most of some of the most contentious issues that now members are facing in order to achieve this consensus, right? So we will discuss later about some of these issues. And now I'd like to give the floor to our rapporteur, Pallavi.
Thank you, Edna. I'm going to begin again by echoing what everyone else has said. Thank you to the organizers, to Elsa, to the organizers of the John H. Jackson Moot Court, to the panelists, and to Edna for putting this event together. And congratulations to all the participating teams. I believe you've all done a really good job, and we're looking forward to the final rounds. Thank you to the panelists for a very insightful and invigorating discussion. This has been a real task to actually summarize. So I'm going to make a humble attempt at summarizing what has been a very, very rich discussion. And I'm going to go point by point on the 5 questions that were posed. On the point of what are the global challenges that have impacted the Asian region the most, I think there was a lot of very interesting challenges that were put forward. Beginning, of course, with the COVID-19 pandemic and its economic and social unprecedented impact, including on exposing the gaps in supply chains, on the export restrictions that ensued in the process, and in the regionalization of supply chains as well. There was also the issue of climate change that was discussed and how trade can facilitate the preservation of the environment without recourse to protectionism. And more significantly, of course, the larger issue of digital connectivity and the broader, more pressing issue of making international trade more inclusive, more equitable, and making sure that countries and more vulnerable groups like women and young entrepreneurs, small businesses aren't left behind in the recovery from COVID-19. Another key issue discussed was the low intra-regional trade and economic inequality within the Asian region, and the increasing upward regulatory convergence and standards, particularly in the field of technology, which is a growing concern for members in the region. And of course, the ongoing crisis with the appellate body and the dispute settlement body and negotiating outcomes in general. On the issue of how the WTO rules-based system can address these challenges, we had some very, very interesting points made. Of course, is the only platform for multilateralism in trade. It was obvious that it can help lay the foundation for global recovery from COVID-19 by first addressing export restrictions and encouraging a move from self-sufficiency towards collective security, in addressing investment issues pertaining to stabilizing supply chains and closing the gaps there, in creating a level playing field on issues of climate change, e-commerce, digital trade. And of course, there was a discussion as well on the growing number of FTAs and the move to plurilateralism, which of course indicates the members' frustration at the pace at which negotiations are moving at the WTO, but also indicating that members see worth in agreements, in trade agreements, in addressing issues of increasing trade and decreasing trade costs overall. The panel also noted the value of the review and monitoring mechanism of the WTO, in particular in managing specific trade issues. When addressing the issue of the missing elements to strengthen the rules-based system that the WTO would need to tackle global challenges, of course, there was a discussion on the continued issue of actual elimination of tariff and non-tariff barriers, which was brought to the fore during the COVID-19 pandemic with reference to essential goods and medical supplies, and also facilitating their movement across borders. The general comprehensive discussion on climate change, including rules and standards leading to a level playing field towards addressing the challenge of the role of trade in climate change. Again, the negotiations on e-commerce and digital trade, which are moving, just not as fast as all of us would like to. The inclusion of women and small businesses and young entrepreneurs, which of course is going to be critical in rebuilding back from COVID-19 and creating the level playing field that we've been talking about. There was also a discussion on the role of judicial activism and its place in the dispute settlement mechanism. And critically at this point, of course, the missing element of a functional appellate body and how that can be addressed, wherein again, there was a discussion on the need for a functional appellate body, but also making sure that the consensus mechanism of the WTO is reinforced. The panel also discussed why the rules-based system is critical in order to address these challenges. And of course, the the pillars of the WTO were brought forward, which includes transparency, predictability, and rationality of trade regulation, and in preventing interest-captured institutions from disguising protectionism as health or green concerns, as has happened during the pandemic, and also to ensure a focus on multilateralism over plurilateralism or bilateralism in engagements to ensure that gains from trade can be distributed more equitably across countries and, of course, across stakeholders. There was, of course, the discussion of the crown jewel of the WTO, the dispute settlement mechanism, which is a one-of-its-kind facility available to membership, and therefore it's so important to bring back some sort of mechanism to fill the gap that the appellate body has left behind. And again, there was a discussion on whether the plurilateral mechanism or the method of plurilateralism is a better way forward or will actually provide a functional resolution to this issue. In particular, focusing on the issue of how members of the Asian region Asia-Pacific region can revitalize the WTO rules-based system. It was agreed that the Asian region, which has thus far been a quieter and less significant player in multilateral trading system, has of course a lot to contribute in this regard and should take more responsibility to promote and support the multilateral system of international rules on trade. The panel encouraged members to focus on reducing barriers to trade and towards equitable distribution to create an environment of trust and cooperation, and to move from self-sufficiency to collective security once again. To this end, all WTO members, of course, it was addressed, have a role to play in ensuring that gains from trade are distributed more equitably, not just within the Asian region, and a return to consensus as decision-making mechanism at the WTO will be critical in this regard. It was also discussed that there is a need to replicate the success and value of agreements like TRIPS and the Trade Facilitation Agreement, which have had particular significance for members. And it was discussed that members of the Asia-Pacific region, and of course all WTO members in general, need to support collective action to revive the appellate body and revisit the development dimension of the WTO with specific reference to this special and differential treatment provision, which again has been specifically relevant in times of the COVID-19 pandemic. I hope that my humble attempt at summarizing the discussion has been successful. If I've left anything out, I'm really sorry for that. Back to you, Edna.
It was extremely successful, very comprehensive and deep at the same time. Thank you very much, Pallavi, for making this effort. Now we will proceed with a question. I would like to give the floor to each one of the speakers, so you can comment on each other's presentations. Thank you very much. Who would like to take the floor? This is not on a structured base, but whoever wants to take the floor first is more than welcome. But if we don't have anyone that would like to volunteer, perhaps I would like to give the floor to Professor Hong Sao. Would you like to comment on someone's presentation?
Thanks very much for this opportunity to start in responding to questions. I think these are the very relevant questions to the presentations made. I'm not sure how, in light of Professor reading, that what is in her perception that the measures of the UNICEF can ensuring the benefit that trade flow more to countries that left behind, which are the more differential management that is required for those that left behind if you want to secure the chances for them to have access to international. And I don't know, I think it is most countries in this that is left behind will be considered specifically. What are the difficulties and how to help them to be to allow them have more opportunities if they have competitive basis that won't have. So I'm not so sure. I just it is a quick thought. I think for that purpose, I'm not aware of the current position of China on whether they support the idea of having one instances of the dispute settlement. I think what I haven't followed the memos of DSB. Since I'm at the appellate body, I will be provided with the memos of DSB each month. So I closely the major members. But according to my knowledge, if it hasn't changed the position, I think China's position on this regard is to resume the selection process. I'm not sure. At the time I left, I think there are 121 members still recalling that selection process be resumed. That is the easy part. MPIA, China's position is supportive before the appellate body will be fully restored. But then how is my personal view? I think it's asking our personal view on the not preserving the second instance that and on the MPIA. Personally, I think for MPIA, I expressed my views in mechanism. It is useful to this plurilateral approach to settle dispute with the two stages. That is, their right that has been negotiated according to the DSU. I think it's useful, but there are also many challenges. And for the my view is that my question mark, I said a big question mark on how long that the system could last one instance to dispute under the current DSU, because the current DSU has set up two instances. And without the second, the process cannot be completed. The case, if appealed, will be pending, except the two parties accept the panel report as final one. So if the questions about the WTO members will be opening to a renegotiation of the DSU, I don't know. I don't know what is the question targeting about. If that's on that front, I think that's a big issue. I never heard about, even from the former current administration of the United States. So I don't know how to comment on that. That is too big. It's a kind of presumptive issue. I think it is not. It's not a real issue, and I think that I do not respond a question on a theoretical basis. To that allow other panelists to respond to these two questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting and enriching views. Yes, it has been said openly from the former U.S. administration. They questioned the necessity of including a second instance, and also and the position hasn't changed apparently at the moment. So in the current administration, so this is something that the members are questioning for the moment. That's why it was interesting to hear your views on this. Does anyone, before we proceed with the questions of the audience, does anyone has any, would like to comment on something from each other's presentations?
Yeah, Edna, can I just mention one point?
Yes, please.
So, I mean, this is again one point which I did not get the time initially to mention. So, if you look at the long history, so there was actually an observation that possibly the Doha round could be the last round. I mean, there won't be any further trade rounds in the future. So, one possible issue, one problem is that there were so many issues which were mandated for negotiation, and in the context of WTO, I think certain issues after a period of negotiations, maybe 10 or 15 years of negotiation, die a natural death. So there are so many issues which are actually on the unfinished agenda. And now there's actually a move to have negotiation on fresh issues or the new issues, right? And these are basically the 21st century issues in a way. Obviously, I think it is an extremely important point to have negotiation on new issues. But should the new issues be taken up on a different track, or should it be actually combined with some of the old issues? So if new issues are actually taken on an expedited track, then some countries may have the feeling that, okay, some of their most important issues, to just give an example, agriculture subsidies. Agriculture subsidies, even Dr. Professor Michael mentioned that agriculture subsidies require a significant amount of revamp. Even we are actually using a 1986 fixed external reference price, even without any inflation indexing. So, and when we think about subsidies, should it be limited to only industrial subsidies? So the point is that some of the issues will have to be combined with other issues. And that is one point which I wanted to mention in my opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Saeed, you have the floor.
Yeah. Thank you, Edna. I also I wanted to compliment what I said when I was talking about that, in my view, the time for trade rounds is probably behind us, and it is going to be a bite-size negotiations. In that context, I wanted to share with the participants that when I look at the work of the regular committees, to be absolutely frank, I'm a bit disappointed in the sense that, except for, and that was for at least some time, for 10-15 years, the SPS committee has been working with the members to improve the guidelines, to come up with those things which can further complement towards the SPS agreement. All other committees, the best their contribution has been some discussion on specific trade concerns. There is a likelihood, and I would definitely suggest that these regular committees, instead of just ticking the boxes once a year or every 2 times a year, why we cannot convert these into perpetual negotiating forums. And there is a constant negotiation with a view to improvement. And if there is something which is beyond the existing agreements, then it might be raised to the level of the General Council or the Ministerial Conference. But there should be a discussion how the existing agreement can be better implemented. Sharing of best practicing, clarifying certain things, coming up with harmonizations and all those. And there could be umpteens of ideas in every committee specific to that agreement. I think there is a need that the mandate and the working of these regular committees of the WTO needs to be looked into and strengthened. Thank you.
Excellent remark. And I think this is what it matters the most now. Like, we need to make progress and take advantage of this prices so we can, or so members can actually make strong and significant moves towards this revitalization of the WTO. So I fully agree with your view, Dr. Said. Does anyone has any other question or any other remark to make with each other's presentation? Okay, if there are no further interventions, then I will, someone from the audience wanted to ask a question to Professor Ridings. Would you like to take the floor?
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you very much for that question, which is in the chat box. I think first, I just simply want to echo what Dr. Nedra said about the development dimension. I think that's really important. But I would also go on and say that the answer to the question about how to make sure that countries are not left behind is actually, it can be very, very lengthy. So I'm just going to mention a couple of points. First, we've already heard about the need for intra-regional trade and with respect to the Asian region. But I would also note in respect of Africa, the same problem occurs. And the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is designed specifically to actually encourage intra-regional trade. And that's based upon the idea that you have to accept the first premise that trade is an engine for growth. If you accept that premise, then obviously intra-regional trade will also assist in a more equitable basis for bringing countries along. But also, I would make two other points. First, that developing countries are often agriculture exporters. So exporters of agricultural goods. We all know the amount of agricultural subsidies which are going to the production of agricultural goods in many developed countries. So that is one way where the reduction of agriculture subsidies, not just simply the agriculture export subsidies, which were prohibited as a result of the 2015 Nairobi work during the Nairobi ministerial, but also domestic subsidies. But more importantly, also, there should be, we're finding that standards are being used as effectively protectionist measures. And it's very difficult often for developing countries to be able to meet the standards of some developed countries. That's not to say that there shouldn't be standards, but developing countries should be facilitated so that they can actually meet those standards. And so that would be another way in which to actually ensure that developing countries can be brought along in ensuring that the benefits of economic growth are more equitably shared amongst all the peoples and members of the WTO. So that's a very brief answer to that excellent question.
Thank you very much. I do have a question for Professor Hong Sao. I would like to know, the US and the EU have used the non-market economy methodology to calculate the anti-dumping duties regarding China. It is the main allegation that this is because China keeps supporting its enterprises and it cannot be considered as a market economy. What would be the China's middle ground for finding solutions for this issue? Thank you.
Professor Hong, you are on mute.
Oh, thank you for this question, but I kind of do not believe I'm in a proper position to respond at this moment on the question on this front. I believe myself in a position to be transforming myself from the function of a formal appellate body to the researcher or the professor, and I don't want to comment too much on that, and I don't know whether I'm in a proper position to say there's either grounds for the Chinese government, unions, and what has been claimed by China. This is also, I think, a complicated issue. No, I currently would like to provide another perspective to see, the nature of the economy, market or non-market. I think it is difficult to define market or to have. If we say the direction of the economy is if there's a more pursuing of a social perspective or social stability perspective, measure the nature of the pure economic side. I think the pure economic, how to measure economy and take into more objectives, and the society or the economy, always say a nation might be a pursuit after. And thinking on how to the Chinese the philosophy. It is the ancient philosophy, but I'm not sure on this method, on this issue, that China will take that position or not. I'm not in position representing the Chinese government. I don't know what is their position.
We're having trouble on listening. Perhaps if we turn off our cameras, because we cannot listen, Professor Sao. Professor Sao, are you still there? Yeah. Now you're muted. Perhaps you have finished, right? Okay, so we will proceed with another question. This one is for Mr. James Nadumpara from Mark. Marcus Gallen. So he's asking that India wasn't ready to join the RCP. Would India be ready for the next ministerial to agree on fisheries subsidies negotiations? Are you aware of what is the position of India? Thank you.
Of course, I think I don't want to comment anything on the ongoing negotiation, but I think if you look at the popular press writings, this is perhaps the one major substantive agreement that we will have in the last 25 years. I mean, that is a kind of popular belief. I think most of the countries still are ironing out some of the controversial areas, especially on differential issues in the fisheries negotiation. But I think there is a greater realization that we have to do something in order to conserve the disappearing fishery stock. So on that point, I feel that most of the countries are cooperating very well.
That's an excellent news to hear. So yes, indeed, as you said, special and differential treatment is always is a must thing to address, of course. But there are ways of addressing it, and the trade facilitation agreement has been a wonderful source of inspiration for other members to take into account new ways of finding solutions to approach the special and differential treatment. So it is great to hear this news. Then there is another question for Dr. Mohamed Saeed. With the current permitted participation of the private sector to the WTO, that is basically the amicus curiae or the WTO public forum, is there any way that the private sector can contribute to enhance the WTO rules-based system? And how would you envision a deeper participation of the private sector in the WTO negotiations arm? Thank you.
Thank you, Edna. Let me say you special thanks yet that you kept the most difficult question for the last for me. So let me wear my official hat that at the ITC, not only for any negotiations, but also the implementation of the different agreement, we always encourage that those should be approached from the business perspective, and especially, if possible, from the lens of the MISMEs or SMEs. Regarding the private sector involvement in the WTO negotiation process, in the public forum and other forums, I am for it. In the negotiation process, let me share with you my view that I am convinced that the success of the Doha round and even the conclusion of the trade facilitation agreement was because there was a very deep interest from the private sector. And that is how the Doha round was completed, and that is how the trade facilitation agreement was completed. I think it is not only the legal, social, but the moral duty of any government that they must consult their businesses, but within their own national jurisdictions, that how the trading disciplines can be improved and can be agreed at the multilateral forum. The involvement, direct involvement of the business private sector in the negotiating process would, in my view, further complicate the negotiating process. We are already 164, and also out of 164, maybe there are 50 countries whose private sector would be equipped enough or knowledgeable enough or courageous enough to come and face and discuss what they want multilateralism or multilateral system to achieve and agree to. But it will be at the expense of the already this very, very slow process of negotiations. So I would say any meaningful trade relations cannot be a good agreement unless it addresses the aspiration of the private sector. But at the same, and there should be a mechanism, and even the WTO, ITC, or even other organizations, World Bank, they should work towards bringing the business perspective into the negotiation, improving their capacity to advocate for the trade reforms, telling them the business implication of whatever is being negotiated. But their direct involvement in the negotiating process, I have my reservations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we can go on and on with multiple questions. Unfortunately, we are our time has been it is limited because we have participants that are waiting for the results of this competition. But before we end this webinar, I would like to provide some conclusions that we can that we have seen in this very rich webinar with that provided the Asian perspective. First of all, we have heard that self-sufficiency, as Professor Michael Ewing Chung highlighted, is not the way forward, and it's impossible just because of climate change challenges. So we have also identified other global challenges that are extremely important, that as Professor Ridings mentioned, like making international law more equitable and inclusive is as such a challenge. So this is something that we need to keep working on it, and then finding ways on how to include women, the private sector, including, of course, SMEs, and the youth, of course, in all these areas. And then, as Dr. Said just mentioned, we need to find efficient ways of including these other stakeholders into the decision arena. And as he said, like trade facilitation agreement, the way they included the private sector has been the successful way, and it keeps being included the private sector now that countries are implementing their this trade facilitation agreement at a national level. So then is a way forward to include the private sector. Then also Dr. Said rightly highlighted that the WTO is the only existing platform to liberalize at a multilateral level, and that there are aspects that are not inside, that it haven't been included elsewhere. And in other free trade agreements, and among all the members that participate, the 164 members benefit from this multilateral platform. So it's also very important to keep to make it work again, but we all agree that it's an outdated platform. So we need a WTO-based system on norms, as Professor Sao highlighted as well, based on norms and with a legal binding mechanisms to provide certainty and predictability. So otherwise it will be back into the GATT times, and it cannot provide the certainty and predictability that it has always provided, and that has been considered as the jewel of the crown. And then also we need to have this collaborative action that Michael highlighted. We need to change mentalities, as Professor Sao mentioned. But Professor Riding said consensus, it is very difficult to achieve. So we need to find other ways. And the ways that have been, and most of the speakers mentioned that plurilaterals are a way forward, but also we can see that there is this discussion for the members that actually are not even, as Professor James highlighted, that some members are even questioning that the terminology of using plurilaterals is the adequate one. But independent, then that's why there are statements from South Africa and India where they question the legal validity of these plurilaterals, and that they should be called joint statement initiatives, the GSI. And then this is valid, but as it has been said by other ambassadors in other webinars, this is more than a legal issue. It is a political issue that it can be solved. So independently on how they are called, it has been shown that consensus hasn't worked. The critical mass that Professor Jackson's proposed years ago hasn't been taken into account. So then there is, we need to find ways to move this, to move the system and to find agreements. So, this is, but it's interesting to hear the views of some of the members, and indeed, of course, the development dimension cannot be lost, and the special and differential treatment needs to keep working, and that's why there is so much discussion out there now on how to address it. And as I said before, there are ways that are already working, as the trade facilitation agreement on has shown it. So it is critical, but there are ways to address these issues. So as Professor Said said, the technical expertise exists and is vast. But to achieve these changes, we need political will. The two big countries of this region play a big role for achieving these changes. And now they have the opportunity to show that there is a will for changing, for updating the WTO, and for making it a rules-based system again. And then how can we find this will is perhaps a very challenging area. But if they see, if countries in general see that the WTO has a bigger purpose than only facilitating trade and the benefits that are derived from the WTO being functional, then I think, and how the WTO is a problem solver, then that is something that countries need to take into account, and that countries will facilitate this will to make it happen, and to be a game changer in this reform that is highly needed. So thank you very much to each one of you, and we look forward to having you in other spaces of the John H. Jackson competition. So with this, we conclude this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Edna.
Thank you, Edna.
It was a pleasure participating.
Yeah,
thank you, Edna. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Good night from Singapore.
Bye-bye.
Bye from New Zealand.